coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
It's funny regarding Ukraine. Biden sort of gave the game away the other day when, in defense of the spending bill, he said, "Well, don't forget, like all this money is going to be spent right here in the USA, like the $96 billion, because it's all going to defense contractors." I mean, that's essentially the dirty secret of all of this aid, is that it's just all being pushed through. And this has been the case for decades. Like, we talk about the trillions of dollars spent in Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, yes. And some of it surely did wind up in the pockets of whoever's over there, whatever warlords or politicians or, in Iraq and Afghanistan. But a lot of it just went to pumping up the real estate values in the DC metro area. And, in Alabama and Oklahoma and wherever else these contractors are. Hello, and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I am your host for today, Seth Barron, managing editor of the American Mind. I'm joined by publisher and president of the Claremont Institute, Ryan Williams, and editor of the American Mind, James Poulos. Spencer Klavan, your typical host, is on a holiday in Cambodia, for anyone who remembers that tune. But he will be back next week. Well, just in time for a big vote on defense spending in Ukraine and Israel, and another vote on extending spy powers, we have news of a major issue of supposed national security, which appears to involve a Russian space attack on an American satellite. And it seems like there's a question, is this really a Russian provocation in the final frontier? Or is this a tactic to get us all rallying around the flag? James, what do you think?
Well, as of this moment of recording, it appears that the concern is that the Russians have the capability and are signaling a willingness to potentially utilize nuclear weapons in space. There is a neat use case for nuclear weapons in space. It's really difficult to use nuclear weapons on Earth. It's obviously frowned upon, has a lot of adverse consequences. So what do you do with these things? Well, you can use them to kill satellites. And the idea is that a well-placed nuclear-powered nuclear weapon satellite killer in space can really just knock out an adversary's entire kind of digital infrastructure in orbit. Needless to say, this would be very destabilizing, and also needless to say, it's not surprising to learn that space, that the orbital layer is becoming a battlefield. It's just a matter of logic and sort of common sense of grand strategy to think that when you start pumping a bunch of these satellites, whether for civilian or military use, up into the orbital layer, the neighborhood will get pretty crowded, and at a certain point, military planners will start to realize that they'd better make contingencies and look for an edge. I think, beyond that, we can say that it's been the policy of the United States of America to pursue a kind of full spectrum dominance in military capability around the entire world. Something that seemed, also fairly logical at the time when the USSR fell. The U.S. had the opportunity to go for world domination for an indefinite period of time with full spectrum military dominance, and we went for it. And the reality is, you can't really do that. Much like we whittled our enemies down to, the infamous axis of evil, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea, and then just kind of hit a wall. Technically, we overthrew Saddam and all that, but really, it turned out to be impossible to rid the world of foes, and of course, to rid the world of evil, as George W. Bush infamously suggested it was his administration's policy to do in his second inaugural. In the same way, you can't really become the military lord of the entire planet. there's always going to be some kind of asymmetric advantage, and I think that it's natural to see Russia and China over the past 20 odd years pursuing those asymmetric advantages. One of them is going to wind up being something like space. The Chinese went for diesel subs that were harder to detect. The Russians have been working on hypersonic stuff. When you're outmatched in one area, you try to gain the upper hand in another. So I don't find any of this particularly shocking, and I'm sure that people who are actually in the defense industry and in space stuff find it even less shocking. Question is what to do about it, and of course how much it's being hyped, as you suggested, Seth, because of the administration's interests in trying to shore up its, I think at this point, fair to say, collapsing strategy in Ukraine and elsewhere. So it's going to be a hot one.
I the sort of fog of communications war, as far as I can see through it, is a little confusing on this one to me. I mean, it is just breaking. We don't really know. But, Mike Johnson assured everyone that this revelation from the House Special Select Committee on Intelligence, which of course would first hear about such things, he wanted to assure everyone that it was nothing immediate, no great immediate threat, no reason to panic. But that wouldn't be my first response. Well, from a certain perspective, it makes sense. You don't want people to panic, of course, but that wouldn't be my first assessment of the Russians taking out a satellite. And as you guys say, the timing is suspicious. So the immediate reaction across social media by a certain type of right winger was, "Oh, really? Yeah, this is perfect." Right when we're trying to ram through a big appropriation for Ukraine to the tune of many tens of billions of dollars, this pops up right as the Senate passes the supplemental and the House is set to take it up. So there's much swirling half information out there, and yeah, I guess we'll watch it as it unfolds. I will say it would be nice to have a space-based missile defense at this point, a possibility that was first raised in the Reagan administration, and many of our friends worked on. Angelo Codevilla, Brian Kennedy's been on my former president of the Claremont Institute, a longtime boss and mentor of mine, has talked about and researched and worked on this issue for a long time with many peers. And this original idea of space-based missile defense was famously mocked as Star Wars by Ted Kennedy and others. And it's clear that we've had the capability for quite some time, even if we didn't in an acute way have it in, say, 1986 or 87. We certainly have it now, and it seems like this type of development would be much less of a big deal if we'd pressed forward with that technology, which in today's dollars would have been a pretty small investment, all things told. And just to catch people up, the long-time argument from a certain portion of the realist right, well, maybe the Kissingerian right, and the academic right and right center on international relations, and with the left, although they made different arguments, the argument against a very effective missile defense system, which the space-based system would have been, is that it would have been destabilizing in the environment of mutually assured destruction because you take away the mutual part if the U.S. broke free and could fully defend itself. So the common sense view for a long time, sorry about the phone, everyone. Due diligence collapsed here at the beginning of this recording. I blame Spencer's vacation. The common sense view from Americans has always been, well, we could fully defend ourselves from nuclear annihilation. That seems to be good morals, good politics, and good policy. Why haven't we made that happen? Maybe once again showing you that there are some arguments that only PhDs are stupid enough to believe. But here we are. It's a shame we don't have better countermeasures.
It seems like I just wonder, is this odd, alarm that came up just at this moment? To what extent does this speak to a kind of division within the Republican Party between, I guess you could say, the traditional, defense contracting contingent wing of the party and the MAGA side, which, seems to be like, okay, Mitch McConnell sounded happy enough to push through this border bill that included all this money for Ukraine and Israel, all the defense spending. But then the border part of the bill was unsatisfying to the, the MAGA America First side. It's just it's a funny thing that's happening where we've got this division in the party, I suppose. You guys, where do you think this is going? I mean, is this like a key shift in the direction of the Republican Party?
Well, there's a certain reversal. Well, on the just pure partisan level, to pull away a little bit, Seth, from the intra-Republican Party dispute, it has been interesting to see, and I'll commend to everyone. It's now a few weeks old podcast, but the new executive director of the American Conservative, former Claremont fellow, the perspicacious and actually with a pretty good record of predicting some, not black swan events, but making some predictions outside the consensus and being right on more than one occasion. That was Kurt Mills, on whether it be war, a recession, et cetera, in the last decade or so. So Kurt's taking over the American Conservative, and he went on the American Moment podcast, which is run by another former fellow, Sarab Sharma. Some young guys trying to work on low-level staffing for the next administration, among other things. And they had a good conversation. So go check out the American Moment podcast and Kurt Mills' appearance. They talk about a lot of this stuff. But yeah, it's been interesting to see the two parties switch a little bit on the question of defense in the post-Trump era, that is just the last 4 years, where you have a much more hawkish Democratic Party, at least on the question of Ukraine. It's, of course, divided on the Israel question. And you have a Republican Party that I wouldn't say it's dovish, but the kind of old quasi-Buchananist realist camp, again, bracket the Israel thing when we're talking about Buchanan, has made a bit of a resurgence, and it was pushed first politically and coalitionally by Trump. But he was tapping on a brewing sentiment on the right and on the base of a certain tedium with the adventurism of the George W. Bush administrations post 9/11. So it's been interesting to see the parties flip. Although I would suggest it's not that counterintuitive, in the sense that for ideological reasons, the switch makes a lot of sense, because the kind of transatlantic bureaucratic class, which includes the Democratic Party and a certain portion of the Republican Party, are very anti-Russia, because Russia is, for however imprecise this is as a way to describe Russia, has become an avatar against kind of transatlantic managerial wokeness and its stances on LGBTQ issues and the rest, and its Eastern Orthodoxy, or its playing up of Russian Orthodox Christianity. So that all makes sense given the old ideological divisions. As for the intra-party dispute on the right, yeah, I think it is a change, Seth. I think the center of gravity has shifted, and it makes perfect sense, because it ain't the 1980s anymore. I mean, the Berlin Wall came down, and both parties have been trying to figure out where their ballast is on the foreign policy question. And then you had this somewhat unexpected intrusion of 9/11 and the Bush administration's response to it, which in many ways was neo-Wilsonian, as we've discussed on this podcast and written about in the Claremont Review books, and also the American Mind. So I'll just end by saying and reminding folks that it was Angelo Codavilla's contention, and I think he's mostly correct, that all of modern establishment foreign policy, right or left, has been some flavor of Wilsonianism for the last century. That is an emphasis on management, on technocracy, on world policemanism, and it seems to a lot of the Republican Party's base, and maybe even more than the base, that this a recalibration has been in order for some years, at least going back to 91, and the Ukraine conflict and a lot of the rhetoric from the establishment right and even parts of the centrist left, however farther left the centrist left has gone in the last 2 decades, that's certainly true, has been caught up in this, but it's still kind of a Cold War mentality. I mean, the rhetoric on those two factions, the establishment rhetoric, has been arguing, Putin's incursion into Ukraine is just a stepping stone in Poland's next, and that strikes a lot of the realists, some professional and quite formerly Cold War hawkish, like our friend David Goldman, who's been quite critical of our conduct in Ukraine, among other things, agreeing with the American conservative crowd, where maybe he wouldn't have 20 years ago, that the notion that Russia is on the verge of moving through Ukraine and moving on to the rest of Eastern Europe, including Poland or Central Eastern Europe, is absurd. So I think that's where the division is. And it's hard to make sense of a lot of it because we haven't really ever reckoned with what the end of the Cold War meant for sound American foreign policy. We've had some confused attempts, right and left, to figure that out. And maybe some of our friends worked pretty closely on the Trump administration's attempt to chart a new path, say with Trump's speech in Poland and some of his appearances in front of the United Nations. Mike Anton and others worked on that stuff. So we're still trying to figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, I'd certainly agree with all that. And look, Europe doesn't need to get rolled by Russian tanks in order to be defeated within, the next 15 years. I mean, if you just look at the ways that Muslims in Europe, and frankly, some of them in Russia as well, talk about the next 10 to 15 years, it's very much the language of time is on our side. We're going to take over these regimes. These people are weak. They're demographically collapsing. They're on their way out. And it's basically all going to be ours. The Grand Mufti of Moscow, who looks almost exactly in real life like the meme of the Redditor with like the arched eyebrow and the smug face. It's really something. He's talking about it. We've seen the headlines for a long time about Muslim names being the most popular boys' names in Sweden and other Northern European countries. Obviously, Germany's got a lot of Turks. So this idea that Europe is going to be just this sort of flourishing pillar of the rules-based international order unless we allow Putin to sort of march through the entire continent. It's just fanciful, and but it's perversely comforting, because these bigger demographic questions about Islam and about the West, very few of these champions of the rules-based international order seem to have any thought about what to do when faced with that kind of transformation. And in fact, the answer that they do seem to provide, although they don't put it explicitly in those terms, is technocracy, is the transformation of life into one big technological system. And so, well, if you can't stop the Muslim migrants from taking over your civilization, then you can at least add a layer of bots on top, and then maybe you can survive that way. Nobody really comes out and says that, but I think that's, you wouldn't see this kind of rush to full blown technologization of life if there weren't these massive demographic changes happening, and changes that were actively encouraged, by a lot of Western elites, for reasons that we probably don't need to get into and rehearse here. Tony Blair, one of these guys who it seems like you can never get rid of them, even if you vote them out of office, or they are either discredited by their failed grand strategy or whatever. They just don't go away. Is out at the World Government Summit these days with, they got the Albanian prime minister and sort of the other besuited figures you would expect. And I'm just going to read a couple quotes here from their conversation on stage, looking like people very much in control. And I'll leave it at that. Here are a couple lines. The technological revolution gives us the opportunity to reimagine the state itself. It's not the people that corrupt the systems, it's the systems that corrupt the people. So you need to build systems that are then capable to keep the people on leash in terms of respecting procedures. I mean, this is really taking the rules-based international order to a whole nother level. And that is uncompromisingly and unquestionably the opposite of an America First grand strategy. So when we're looking at how Republicans and others are trying to understand how to reconfigure America's position in the world, if you're not doing an America First thing, then you're pretty much going to be sucked into the orbit of the other thing, and that thing is the legacy of technocracy, and it's the Borg.
I'm sort of reminded of something, a little scandal from 50 years ago or so, when Bob Dole, running for vice president in 1976, was attacked for supposedly having called the four 20th century wars that the U.S. had been involved in, Democrat wars. And he sort of had to explain that, no, he didn't mean it that way, that World War II was not a Democrat war. But it's funny that that was a mid-century view, I think, of the Democrat Party, that it was, as opposed to the America First side, or, the sort of paleo Robert Taft style Republicans who really didn't think we needed to be pursuing foreign adventuring. But speaking of, imposing a technological layer on top of decrepit, incapable politicians, last week, Special Counsel Robert Hur released a 400-page document explaining that he wasn't going to bring charges against President Biden for his handling of classified documents, and primarily because, in Hur's opinion, no American jury would convict an octogenarian who can't seem to recall basic facts of his family life or career. The clear implication was that Biden is essentially incompetent to stand trial. So this has prompted, major discussion of essentially the biggest open secret in America, which is that the president is unfit for office. So now we're in a weird position where the deep state seems to be trying to remove both of the candidates for office, both Trump and Biden. One because they're afraid he might win, and the other because they're afraid he might lose. It's kind of a weird situation. We're seeing, major Democrat surrogates denouncing anyone who criticizes Biden's age or his mentality. Others saying, no, I don't even care if Biden is comatose. He's better than Trump. What do you guys think of this? Is this some kind of effort to get Biden out? And will he leave? And then who will replace him?
Yeah, I don't think I'm usually in favor of the Occam's razor explanation of these sorts of things. And I think, and I'm not the first one to bring this up, I don't know exactly who to credit, but there are a few commentators out there. So I'll just say that for the record. But the Occam's razor seems to be the Hur report. Actually, Politico went kind of straight down the line on this in their morning podcast when they have their morning update. It's 3 to 5 minutes or whatever. And they were reporting on it, and it was fairly down the middle in the sense that, well, look, he did the thing that all prosecutors do, or all investigators and people familiar with prosecution do, which is to try to put themselves in the shoes of in the courtroom and try to figure out whether any of this would be viable. And he concluded no, and he had to state some reasons for that. So I think the Democratic fulminations against this report as somehow gratuitous are pretty unfair. And so that all makes sense. And then Biden, of course, got angry about it and insisted on talking to the press about it. So I don't think that there's some elaborate plot afoot where they pushed Biden out in front of the cameras and let him stumble all over himself. I mean, who could predict that he'd confuse the leaders of Egypt and Mexico? That's just a normal Biden gaffe. I should drop as an asterisk. Biden, we've brought this up before, Biden has been a gaffe machine his entire political career. So it's just made worse and accelerated by declining mental faculties. So all of this fits with the normal script. It's going to be, the only way to replace Biden is if you somehow get Jill and Joe to agree to it. There's really not much of a mechanism within the Democratic primary process as it's currently constituted. They could change the rules, of course, but it would be an absolute unholy mess. There's really no way to get him to go unless he wants to go. I mean, invoke a 25th Amendment invocation by his cabinet, and that constitutional provision itself, it's clear that it can be the cabinet, or it actually can be a body that is assembled by the Congress. That's some cabinet officers and some others. I mean, I think that's fanciful, and it would be very damaging just politically to go through that process for the Democratic Party. So I think Biden's here to stay unless some real adverse health event occurs and he and Jill decide, or he and his senior team and Jill, which includes Jill, decide that he really has to go. So I wouldn't expect that to happen. And so here we are.
Well, I'm not suggesting that there's actually like a conspiracy afoot, but that there are always different factions, right?
Yeah.
And certainly there are people who are very concerned about Biden's viability in the election.
Yeah, I think that your deep state point, Seth, I would think that they'd be fairly content to continue with the status quo because this large machine of the center left bureaucracy, including the intel bureaucracy, can keep doing what it wants to do with Biden in office. And then they have affected a firewall against the Trump problem, which was brought to light by J.D. Vance in this supplemental appropriation for Ukraine, which basically puts into this funding statute and ties it up with rules about impoundment and budgeting by the executive, where basically if Trump were to become president, it would immediately make any cessation of Ukraine support an impeachable offense, building off of the facts as they were quote unquote assembled in the was it the first impeachment? Yeah, in the first impeachment, where basically the grounds of that impeachment was that Trump bucked the interagency process and went against the judgment of the defense experts, Vindman and others, on this question of Ukraine funding. That was the deeper lesson of that. I think the Trump being corrupt and trying to get dirt on his opponent was the smokescreen for that more insidious and less visible process, which is the fact of any Republican president now. If he truly wants to be countercultural in the defense establishment and the intelligence community establishment, faces much, much stronger headwinds than a Democratic president. So I think, at least so far, I would say the assembled forces of the bureaucracy are getting their way. Now, the supplemental hasn't passed and it may not pass. So that hamstringing of Trump ahead of time, should he win, maybe won't be a problem. But all the normal headwinds will be there.
Yeah, I guess I don't disagree, Ryan, with anything that you laid out there. Certainly the safe bet is that Biden just kind of hobbles along. That is, one variety of late imperial politics, where you have this figure who just stays on the throne long after their sell-by date, but they really can't be replaced. And if they were taken out or stepped down, then there would be this factional conflict. And you certainly see that and have seen that probably since the day that our real president, Barack Obama, picked up the phone during the Democratic primaries and, said, it's going to be Joe, wrap this thing up. We can't have, Mayor Pete and Kamala just kind of, circus mud wrestling. He put his foot down. And so it's been Biden. And that arrangement has proven to be remarkably durable. Probably helps that Obama's, behind the curtain there. But there is a reason why Joe works, so to speak, and that reason is probably still viable for at least a while. I also think that a lot of people are just pretty tired right now, and the kinds of intrigues and abuses and violations of norms that we saw in the 60s and 70s that went all the way up to the presidential layer, that required a degree of ambition and vitality and mania that seems to be just more or less absent right now. The DC isn't really crawling with scheming G-men and ambitious operators the way that it used to be. You've got, the bald guy with the lipstick stealing people's dresses or whatever. It's just, the vibes are very different. And when you look at the Biden administration and kind of the factions surrounding it, I don't get the impression that these are people either, boasting a high degree of kind of dark triad power, or on the other hand, spiritual strength. And for a lot of them, they're just kind of white knuckling it and hoping to make it through the month with the help of, a bottle or two of wine a night, probably, and lots of pills. However, it is probably true that Joe Biden himself is not going to be able to execute even at the level that he's executing now if someone or someone's decided that they were just going to take him off of whatever regimen of pills and supplements and drugs he is likely already on. There are always these kinds of rumors that go around. I remember when George W. Bush was accused of being on all manner of drugs. But gosh, you look at Joe Biden, you look at the decline, it would be, I think, really far-fetched to imagine that he's not being helped along in some kind of pharmaceutical way. And so there are these questions, I think, it's definitely 2024 isn't really looking the way that Democrats thought or hoped that it would. Donald Trump seems to have the vitality, the stamina, as he put it back in the first time around. He seems to be the only one having fun anywhere near national politics right now. And they just can't, they cannot kill this guy, politically speaking. And so as this kind of panic sets in and these people are staying up on their 8th glass of wine and their second handful of pills, trying to game things out, there is going to be a temptation to kind of make a rash decision. And that decision may lead to a kind of series of unfortunate events like what you might see in the TV series Veep. Like this, this is why people love that show, because it was so accurate about the shambles of DC. And I think there is a reasonable possibility that kind of spreading chaos and incompetence and panic could lead to some really extraordinary events. It could lead to Kamala winding up in a position that she kind of does but doesn't want to be in. It could lead to people coalescing around Newsom and trying to finagle some kind of. I mean, you go back and look at Wilson. We're talking about Wilson on this podcast, so why stop now? He was totally in a basically vegetative state for much of his second term, and his wife was trying to keep the wheels on the wagon. So, look, America's not in great shape. Things are definitely not going our way strategically around the world. The stakes keep rising, and the folks at the wheel are still not ready for prime time, I don't think. And that's a recipe for some surprises.
It's funny regarding Ukraine. Biden sort of gave the game away the other day when, in defense of the spending bill, he said, well, don't forget, like, all this money is going to be spent right here in the USA. Like, the $96 billion, because it's all going to defense contractors. I mean, that's essentially the dirty secret of all of this aid, is that, it's just all being, pushed through. And this has been the case for decades. Like, we talk about the trillions of dollars spent in Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, yes. And some of it surely did wind up in the pockets of whoever's over there, whatever warlords or politicians or, in Iraq and Afghanistan. But a lot of it just went to pumping up the real estate values in the DC metro area and, in Alabama and Oklahoma and wherever else these contractors are. So it was a little bit of a absurd thing to say, but as you said, he's a gaffe machine, and he always says the part that's supposed to stay silent. I was wondering if we could shift gears a little bit. The Super Bowl was a few days ago, and I don't know if you guys watched it or not, but surely you heard about the advertisements. That's like supposedly the biggest attraction of the Super Bowl for many people. But there was one commercial that came on that struck a lot of people as somewhat odd, for this organization called He Gets Us, referring to Jesus. And this was a commercial. I think there were two commercials of it that showed a series of people getting their feet washed. And mostly the people doing the washing were in a position of authority, like a policeman washing the foot of a black man in an alley, someone washing the feet of a bruised woman outside a family planning clinic. I guess maybe she was getting an abortion. A family washing the feet of migrants getting off a bus, washing the feet of a Muslim woman wearing a hijab, washing the feet of a priest washing the feet of a gay black roller skater, et cetera, et cetera. And it said, Jesus didn't hate, he washed feet. And I think a lot of people found this kind of questionable, like a lot of right-wing people on the internet and Christians thought that this wasn't really a very biblical message. It was Christologically inaccurate, and I think some people said that it was a leftist op. However, it was, I mean, I believe it was paid for by the Green family, largely, who, the Hobby Lobby people. So, anyway, what did you guys think of this? Did you see it? What were your responses?
I did see it. It was interesting because I watched the Super Bowl in mixed political company, just a small gathering at our house, mostly with mostly family and then a couple of good friends. And between my wife and I, we have mixed political company amongst friends and family. So, but so that ad came up, and then the liberals in the audience were sort of expecting and anticipating and excited about the other ad, which was funded, the sort of anti-Semitism ad, which was funded by Robert Kraft. So they all seemed to know that that was coming and be interested in it. And then I think they just found the Jesus one sort of interesting and unobjectionable. I I don't know. It's from our friends, like our friends on the Protestant right, and who are very interested in and involved in American Protestantism, that is sort of big church Protestantism in America, which is in the Presbyterian and Baptist communities split on the question of social justice and racial reckoning and all that. They were, as far as I saw them comment on this, they were critical of it because it seemed to them to partake of this sentiment lately on big evangelicalism side of the big Eva, as Megan Basham, our former Lincoln Fellow who writes for the Daily Wire, puts it. It's sort of a little soft. It's sort of soft-headed liberalism masquerading as Christianity. I would say that there's nothing objectionable about preaching the sort of nonpartisan, all soul embracing Jesus. So that part wasn't objectionable. I guess it's just the graphics of the whole thing, situated as they were, and it seemed to be giving nods to the weird culture war obsessions of the left in a lot of those images seem to strike people as pretty discordant. Now, if you're trying to reach across political aisles, political aisle and ideological aisle, to get more people more interested in Christianity, maybe this was very well poll tested and they think it's going to be effective. I don't have any great insight into their rhetorical strategy, but I agree with you, Seth, that it seemed a little odd and had the flavor of modern leftism much more than biblical Christianity. I'll just point everyone, and then shut up and let James comment on it. Point everyone to the Babylon Bee had a brilliant riff that they just dropped on social media with videos in similar fashion. That is to say, this new sort of AI-driven, kind of hyper-realistic, colorized, but very realistic animation. That is, none of these were pictures or live action. It was drawn, or at least maybe pictures that then had an overlay of drawing and stylizing. They did the same sort of video, and they said, Satan, he accepts you just as you are. And they have a drug addict lying on the ground, a very obese guy up in his attic. He never wants you to change. He believes in you. He affirms everything about you. And then they have a scene of a store being looted, especially your sin. He wants to be with you in eternity, ... forever. Satan, he gets us. So I think that in the biting way that the Babylon Bee can do, I think that points to some of the problems, at least as they aesthetically came to us watching the ad for the first time, or how a lot of Americans saw it.
I will add that if you look at the website where they have all the images, they do say all of the images in this gallery were shot by international fine art photographer Julia Fullerton Batten. They do look suspiciously like AI confections. They don't really look like photographs. I don't know whether they are or not, but they're certainly strange. I forgot to mention, one of them is really odd. It shows like these two older guys on a porch, one black, one white, like a really decrepit looking porch that says diner. And in this one, neither of them is washing anybody's foot, but they both have their feet in the same wash tub. And it's just like the weirdest looking image. I don't know what it's supposed to be, but yeah, it's a weird thing. And, somebody pointed out, like I saw, by the way, I was in Times Square yesterday and they had a giant ad and it said, Jesus didn't hate, he washed feet.
Mm-hmm.
But, somebody pointed out, well, Jesus did wash feet in the Bible, but he washed the feet of his acolytes. He didn't go out of his way to wash the feet of like the Pharisees or people who hated him.
Yeah, he did toss everyone. He tossed the moneylenders out of the temple too. So
yeah, I mean,
it's selective.
right.
Jesus liberalism is the kind of the critique, I guess.
I mean, one thing I've heard people say, now I'm not a Christian, so I don't want to speak on behalf of Christians or of Jesus or the Bible, but Jesus did say, I guess, the message is love your neighbor as yourself, but it's not love your neighbor more than yourself. It's not really a religion of total abasement, which is how I think the left's interpretation, the modern interpretation of it is, you have to give everything you have to the miserable and essentially elevate the miserable. And that's the essence of Christianity. And I think it's just more complex than that. But James, why don't you what do you think?
Well, the short space of one irregular length podcast is certainly not enough for me to unburden myself of all my thoughts on this matter. So I will try to keep. I'll try to keep things fairly condensed. These strains of love worshiping, of celebrating merely human love, these things are not the teachings of Jesus Christ. This is not the message of the gospel. I don't want to judge the makers of the He Gets Us campaign. There's some evidence out there that we don't have time to dig into, that they're perhaps, more firm on some of the culture war issues than they might appear. And I think there is evidence that this is part of an attempt to, to move people from like a 1 to a 4 instead of trying to move people from, a 7 to a 9 on the, I don't know, Christian intensity scale or whatever. And people will doubtless sort of argue about which is the more important approach. I personally think that certainly the historical record is pretty clear that mass conversions can happen much more quickly than the statisticians or the social scientists would suppose. That you don't need to inch people along some kind of linear road toward having a full-blown conversion experience. And sometimes inching them along is exactly what will never help them get to that full-blown experience. And so these kinds of issues are going to come increasingly to the fore as the worshipers of technology as a way of creating paradise on earth continue to flex on the rest of us. And the idea that we should all really just be washing each other's feet instead of asserting some kind of organized spiritual authority over the use and development of technology. I think this is a huge mistake. The sensibility of like, well, turn the other cheek. That's not just in your personal life. That's, that should be the basis of our civilization. I mean, that's, that is not what comes out of holy tradition or out of the history of the church. But the legacy of Protestantism in America has been very mixed, to say the least. The factionalism, the crazy sectarian, I mean, everything from televangelism to the various even Mormonism can't hold itself together. All of these denominations are really having serious retention problems. And in the face of, this concerted effort to replace our form of government and our way of life with this social justice, social credit system, with a totally technologized form of rule, I don't think that these scattered strains of kind of do-it-yourself Protestantism are going to be sufficient to give people the spiritual grounding and organization that is necessary to mount a kind of organized and effective resistance or a successful effort to steer technological development and use in a healthy direction, a direction that's going to ensure that America remains recognizably America for for a long time, even for for 10 years. And so I wish that the folks behind this campaign continue to pursue their goals in an effective way. I am not going to question their hearts or whatever, but in a broader sense, it's really not going to be enough to just be nice to people and wash their feet. There's going to be a need for some spiritual institutions that are capable of having the scale and the authority to do what in politics our regime is not supposed to do, which is strictly control the way that individuals behave with the use of technology. That's what the other side is doing. And according to our Constitution, pretty much the best that we can do is to say the American people need to be trusted to bear these dangerous tools and use them. And if we can't trust them to do that, then you can kiss America goodbye. Well, okay, but I think looking at the sort of purist libertarian approach or the kind of purist non-denominational approach, then you really have no authority, and then technology is just going to go in whatever way kind of the most malevolent or well-funded or venal people want it to go. We can and we should do better than that, and it's going to be a fight to get there.
Yeah, indeed. And it's hard to say what is the meaning of welcome the stranger in an era of, jet travel and mass migration where tens of millions of people are on the move. Like, is that really this? I mean, I understand it as a spiritual directive, but how does that work on the level of national policy? And why should our national policy be dictated by the gospel? Anyway, let's move to the segment of the hour where we talk about our favorite pieces from the website and encourage our listeners to go to AmericanMind.org and read the damn site. We are a website. We do publish at least 2 pieces a day, every weekday. That's 10 items a week. There's a lot to read and a lot of content to get through. James, let's start with you. What did you find most illuminating?
Well, this is hot off the presses and right on schedule. Saving America's Future from the Blob by David Goldman. I think Ryan alluded to this piece recently. It's just kind of a soup to nuts tour of how our ruling elite has just made an absolute dog's breakfast of our foreign policy and what we might do to get things back on course. We all see what's unfolding here, and I think even folks on the other side are kind of cringing their way through this year. So we should and we can save America's future from the blob. And David's got just a great kind of intro to coming to grips with the magnitude of it all.
Yeah, it's a great piece. Ryan, what did you think?
Well, I second James's emotion on David Goldman's piece. Actually, when I brought up him earlier, James, I had not yet seen this one. I think it dropped right while we were, at least on our social media. I saw it while we were recording. But I re-exed it, retweeted it, and I should say, as just an aside, our friend Seth Leibson, who has a radio show in Arizona, says that his solution to this Twitter X problem is just to call it Twix. A very sort of at least Gen X joke, if not a boomer dad joke. So thank you, Seth. But I retweeted David's piece from the American Mind social media account and said you should always be reading David Goldman, even if you disagree with him. And for the record, I do not disagree with him. I liked this piece, although I may not agree with every single line of it. Our Gathering Storm by Vance Byers. I think it's interesting because Vance is a former intelligence officer, veteran of that profession for 15 years, and he writes a piece, Our Gathering Storm, the subhead of which is on civil war in America and other unpleasant possibilities. And it's a nice kind of Cook's tour of the problem of elite fracturing that's going on, coupled with the rise of populist discontent and small conflagrations like the Texas border Abbott versus the feds thing. So he sort of goes through how to think about this with a lot of useful links to some interesting writing over recent years on this topic, and then predicts what he expects in the year to come, which is, of course, not civil war, not Yugoslavia, messy kind of civil war, but rather maybe the rise of factional and punctuated violence as we head into a pretty tumultuous election year. But I found it informative, and I think our readers will find it useful, and will find some of his links interesting as well.
Yeah, indeed. I was very happy to get that piece and edit it and get it on the site. I thought it was really interesting. A piece that I really liked came last week called Welcome Home to Somalia by Katja Sedgwick. It's about Ilhan Omar, who recently was recorded giving a speech in her native language, Somali, basically talking about, two Somalis, obviously, and talking about the president of Somalia as our president, and this is his home. And basically, Katya is talking about the tribalism of Ilhan Omar's home nation and the whole perspective on politics that implies, and what it means to import, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people whose sense of, political reality is less grounded in Montesquieu and Jefferson, and more in, say, the Quran, or, pre-Quranic views of tribal identity. It's a good piece. Welcome Home to Somalia. Well, that's about all the time we have for this week. If you want to know more about the work we do, you can go to americanmind.org or claremont.org. If you'd like to support our work, you can click the support tab at the top of the page. We deeply appreciate the donations that fund our work. Or you can leave a 5-star review for us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Subscribe to our podcast. Spread the good news by tweeting about us, telling your friends, posting our items on social media. We really do appreciate all the support we get, and it's thanks to you and because of you that we do what we do. Thanks to our production crew, Jake Gannon and Logan Zeppieri, and thanks to everyone listening. Until next week, this is the Roundtable signing off.